Thank you very much. I'm an old-fashioned kind of person, and I believe in handouts, so I prepared two of them, but I'm afraid there aren't enough copies of either one of them, so we're going to have to project on the screen. Can this be scrolled down to see what's on the, yeah, great. Okay, like that would be good. Okay. The full paper on which this is based is about 39 pages, and it's about to be published by the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, the AA Kent, the Journal of Asian and African Studies. It should be out within a few weeks, I think. I gave a short summary of this paper at the Sino-Tibetan conference in Guangzhou 2 years ago, but I only had about 10 minutes, and it wasn't very satisfactory. So the two handouts which I needed, this one and then an appendix. I thought I would add an amusing appendix about an English morpheme, a performative, which coincidentally has the same shape, to demonstrate kind of similarities and differences. And a sort of lighthearted thing before the banquet. So anyway. This is a simplified version of the Proto-Tibeto-Burman syllable canon. And these are prefixes. The innermost prefix I assume to be older, and the outer one to be newer. I can give you a simple example. The word for to lick is reconstructed this way. But in Tangkul Naga, you have a form like this. But this is clearly secondary because almost all verbs in Tangkul have the prefix k. So this one goes back to Proto-Tibeto-Burman, and this is secondary. So that's why there are two here. This is the initial consonant. This is a glide, R, L, W, Y, vowel, maybe vowel length, final consonant, and an S suffix. The status of tone at the proto level is still controversial. Some people, like my guru Benedict, believed you could reconstruct tone for Proto-Tibeto-Burman. I personally believe that tones have come and gone in the history of the family many times, because this is a language family which is hospitable to tones, tone prone. So what I want to talk about today is the prefixes which can go back to Proto-Tibeto-Burman. These. And several are set up for Proto-Tibeto-Burman. S, M, B, D, G, R, L. These are by far the most important because they have the clearest semantic content. S is a causativizer or a transitivizer. M is the opposite of that, inner directed or stative meaning instead of outward directed causative or transitive. These occur sporadically and look as if they're reductions of initial syllables and compounds, although they're so ancient that it's now very hard to demonstrate that. So among these prefixes is this one, which is reconstructed as a. And I believe this is a serious oversimplification because, well, in the first place, all the other prefixes are consonantal. But in many of the daughter languages, you have this form. And it's not nice to leave out glottal stop, even though in some languages it's automatic, as in German, before a vowel. But Mary Haas used to say that if you don't write glottal stop, you might as well not write T. So I sort of believe that. So I would like to look at this prefix from 2 points of view. I call this morphosyntactic, from a morphological point of view and from a semantic point of view. So did I say morphosyntactic? I meant morphosemantic. Morphosemantic. The morphosemantics are summarized in this monstrous chart here. You notice, by the way, that this syllable canon goes beyond the simple monosyllable. Once you have prefixes, you usually get them vocalized by schwa or a or some other vowel. So it's really sesquisyllabic. Sesqui, of course, means 1.5. And this sort of syllable structure is rampant in Southeast Asia. It's a hallmark of the Mon-Khmer family, and it also is very obvious in certain branches of Tibeto-Burman. So this is a necessary stage between disyllabic, sesquisyllabic, monosyllabic. And changes of syllable structure happen with distressing regularity. So what I want to do, instead of just reconstructing the ah, the full morphophonemic range of this prefix is on page 2 of this handout here. First of all, I want to reconstruct both stressed and unstressed variants. And in addition, we need both open syllable and nasal final variants. Now, this is perhaps the most difficult to accept of my hypotheses here. Ah, there it is, yes. Yeah, on this first page here, I take an arbitrary syllable ta and show what happens to it in the various languages. So, many languages have disyllabic forms with a fully syllabic ah. These include several languages described by Shintani Tadahiko. Shanke, Zotong, Zayang. Shanke is a Naga language. Zotong is a Chin language. Zayang is a Karenic language. You have Tibetan and Lahu. So many other languages in the family are of this type, fully disyllabic with an initial ah with a glottal stop. Other languages have an unstressed variant. And, the most important language from that point of view is Burmese, which has the unstressed variant ah with this consonant before the root. This is such a pervasive prefix in Burmese that if you start writing a dictionary of Burmese, you would have to duplicate almost every entry. Madame Bernot talked about this in that film we saw the other day, because it's an extremely productive prefix. It sometimes converts verbs into nouns, but sometimes it's just there for phonological bulk to give the word greater phonological power. Okay, now here comes something that some people might find hard to accept. There is a phenomenon which I have called rhinoglotophilia in an article written back in 1975. I know it sounds like a disease or maybe even a perversion, but by rhinoglotophilia, what I mean is the connection between glottality and nasality, and the interesting fact that syllables with initial laryngeals, H, glottal stop, or 0, very often have allophonic nasalization in them. And there are many, in the full handout, this is discussed on page 4 and 5. A language like Thai has nasalization in syllables that begin with glottal stop or H. So the word for 5, written H-A-A, is from ha, to take, ow, glottal stop A-W. Ak, to leave. Lahu is another language like that. The numeral for 4 is aw, but it's usually pronounced on. Aw to bend, ha, elephant, ha to wrap up. And you can see you can get both the nasal and the glottal feature in the same syllable. Ha has both a glottal stop and a nasal. Yiddish also has a few examples like this. The word for Jacob in Hebrew is Yaakov, but in Yiddish it becomes Yankiv or Yankel. This glottal stop is realized as a nasal in that word, many other words. My colleague John O'Hala, who's a phonetician, and I have had many discussions about the connection between nasality and glottality over the years. And he has elaborate explanations based on both articulatory and aerodynamic factors. These are discussed on page 4. I'll just quickly read through this. Vowel nasalization frequently occurs in the environment of laryngeals because, for one thing, nasal-oral coupling has negligible acoustic or perceptual effect on laryngeals, so that people are free to follow the principle of least effort, not bothering to raise the velum when it is not absolutely necessary. And secondly, there's no aerodynamic requirement for velar closure in the articulation of laryngeals. It's also true that there's a preference for low vowels in order for this nasalization to take place. And the reasons for that seem to be the main effect of nasalization on sonorants is a downward shift in the region of the first formant. Thus, the lower the first formant of a vowel is to begin with, the less apt it will be to suffer the further degradation of a downward shift. Since low vowels have higher first formants than high vowels, they are less resistant to nasalization. Okay, so what I want to claim is, can we go back to the original chart, please? This one here. That via rhinoglotophilia, there are still two kinds of results. You can either get the stress variant or the unstressed variant. The stress variant would have like a full syllable ang before the root. We're taking ta as the arbitrary root. So languages like Nikir, a lot of southern lowish languages like Bisu, Ponoi, Lahu. The Lahu vowel aw, by the way, regularly comes from ang. That's one of the main sources of aw. Okay. There are further wrinkles. Some languages have a pre-palatalized variant. So Mikir, Lota, Aka seem to have a Y element or a Yod element before the prefix. Other languages go further and drop the vowel altogether, so you just have pre-nasalized initials, or in the case of Lahu, the Lahu voice series comes from an original pre-nasalized series. So you get all the way from disyllabic things like ang-ta to things like da or n-ta. Can we go up a little more, please? Scroll down a bit. Yes, there's a further development peculiar to Lahu and maybe some other languages, maybe some of you have data on other languages, where there's a variant ah in the high rising tone. And I demonstrated a long time ago that the Lahu high rising tone comes from syllables with two glottal incidents in them, a glottalized initial and a glottal stop final, which comes from final PTK. So it's a very pervasive variational process in Tibeto-Burman that you get alternation between homorganic final stops and nasals. So Lahu went a further distance and has a variant ak, which became ah. So in fact, Lahu has three different ah prefixes. It has ah, it has aw, and it has ah. This one is from plain ah, although the glottal stop disappears in Lahu. This is from ang, and this is from ak. Okay, now where do these variants occur? So, let's go to the first page of the other handout, where I go into the semantics of the thing. This is the one that says, which has figure A semantic flowchart of the PTB ah prefix. Yes, there we are. Okay, I think the basic meaning of this prefix is something like inalienable permanence. And what are inalienably possessed things? First of all, one's own name is inalienably possessed. So typically, this prefix occurs before people's names. Kinship terms, one's relatives are things you can't get rid of. They're inalienably possessed. So there are two kinds, there's both vocative and referential, and I think in many languages this a prefix is a marker, like in Chin languages, of the third person, and I think that ultimately comes from this kind of kinship use. Parts of the body are certainly inalienable. And genitives, things which you possess, you have more or less permanently, unless something bad happens. Okay, so these are nouns, but then the prefix also occurs with verbs. With colors are sort of ambiguous in Tibeto-Burman between nouns and verbs. They have verbal qualities and they have nominal characteristics, but colors are also, even though things can change in color, that's sort of inalienable. If a house is green, it's not going to turn red tomorrow. And then by extension, you get adjectives, which in Tibeto-Burman and Southeast Asia in general are really stative verbs. And qualities are things which are more or less inherent. So you can see how quasi-permanent qualities can extend to that. And finally, you even get action verbs with this prefix sometimes. A verb which is nominalized is more permanent in a way than if it hasn't been nominalized. And then finally, showing bleaching of function, you sometimes get this prefix where there's no good reason for it, but it seems it's there for phonological bulk. So morphologically, it's complicated, and semantically, it's kind of complicated. But, and it's also true that in some languages, an ang prefix is differentiated semantically from an a prefix. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they don't have the same origin, because once things have different forms, they can undergo semantic divergence, which is what has happened. So one side benefit of this paper, I think, is to discuss the mysterious Tibetan letter called Ch.1, which seems to have both nasal and glottal characteristics, as we'll see in the later part of the paper. Okay. Speaking of nasality, let's look at the different possibilities there are for nasal consonants in Tibeto-Burman. This is on page 5 of the bigger handout. So sometimes you get a nasal consonant plus a full vowel, as in lota. Go up a little bit. Yes, there we are. Yeah. Sometimes you get a nasal consonant plus schwa, like m in Jingpo, a very common prefix. Sometimes you get a syllabic nasal homorganic with a root initial, like mb, which you also get in Jingpo. Sometimes you get a glottal stop plus a full vowel plus a nasal consonant, ang. Sometimes you get that, except it's unstressed and becomes ng. Sometimes the nasal consonant disappears altogether and you just have nasalization of the vowel. You have a. And then sometimes you suffer disappearance of the vowel, apheresis of the vowel, and you just have a monosyllabic root, b, b, b. Okay, and this is analogous to the continuum of erosion of nasal final consonants that you find, say, in Lower Burmese, where the proto-rhyme am in modern Burmese is reduced to a, but in Lahu, the nasality has disappeared altogether and is replaced by a difference in quality of the vowel. Okay. So now let's go back page 2 of this handout, which says Semantics of the A prefix. So the stressed version of the prefix A occurs widely in kinship terms. Wolfenden, the great pioneer in Tibeto-Burman morphology, his 1929 book, Outlines of Tibeto-Burman Linguistic Morphology, noted that it occurs widely in kinship terms. Some written Tibetan kinship terms are listed in the bottom of the page. By the way, I just received a copy of Yankee Modi's Milang grammar, and there on page 120, she talks about A being used with kinship terms. So in that macro-Tani language also, you get the same thing. Okay, going on to Jingpo. Jingpo has a prefix which used to be written A, but Laurent Moran changed it, made it more accurate to and later revised it to with a glottal stop. And Moran was the first to observe that vocative forms of kinship terms, which begin with a sonorant, are pronounced with glottalized initials. So, daughter-in-law, Nam rather, Na, elder sister, father, Wa, grandma, Woi, maternal cross cousin, Ning, mother, Nu, and so forth. Leroux was the first to note that there were pre-glottalized initials in Jingpo. That's a big discovery. Okay, Lahu has two kinship prefixes, A, which is usually vocative, and O from Ang. These are both used in kinship terms. The A tends to be vocative, and the O is more referential. Okay, we already mentioned genitive constructions and the pronominal prefixes in languages like the Chin group. But sometimes it's, the function of this prefix is quite elusive, and I'm forced to just have refuge in the concept of phonological bulk. So for example, sha in Lahu means meat or a game animal, but in compounds it means flesh. So you get va is pig, va sha is pork, but if you have the prefix o or sha, it always means meat or flesh. It cannot mean animal. So here, it's not just phonological bulk exactly, but it's some kind of semantic differentiation. By the way, you often get cognate object constructions in Lahu where you have a noun with the o prefix and then the identical verb without the prefix. So ti is to wrap something, or ti means a package. So it's kind of a nominalizer there. But then you get constructions like o ti ve to wrap a package. It also is a classifier. So o ti te ti means one package. So you can say o ti te ti ti ve. You have three instances of ti. The first one is with the prefix o, and it's a noun. The second one is just ti without the prefix, and it's a verb. And then you can get it after a numeral, where it's a classifier. So in the full version of the paper, I give a lot of examples of the fully stressed prefix. I already mentioned the languages discussed by Shintani, Shanke, Zotung, Zayen. There are others too. The Tangkul Naga has the same prefix. A recent dissertation has the identical prefix in Tangkul Naga. Okay, looking at Southern Loloish now, page 6, we see in languages like Bisu, Punoi, Bien, which is another language studied by Shintani, you get sometimes the full syllable ang. Sometimes it's reduced to just the nasalized vowel a. And in the case of Lahu, it becomes o. Rawangish used to be called Nungish, but that's an inaccurate term. You get the unstressed variant, very ung. Wadam Kong, another language studied by Shintani, has both the a and the ang. And they have slightly different functions. But as I said before, just because they might have slightly different functions doesn't mean they necessarily can't go back to the same root.